colleagues and neighbors.
This meeting is being recorded.
Oh, now we're recording. Good morning, everyone. And so I'd like to welcome you all to this third TAG meeting. We are going to have a tight 90 minutes today and hopefully have a lot of time for discussion. With us today, of course, our Cascadia partners, Ayano Healy and Sachi Arakawa and Alexander Steinberger, who goes by Steiny. And we are very excited to welcome you all back. There's a lot of new data to look at, which I know as a technical group, everybody's warming their hands up for the excitement of that. And a lot of insights to discuss in terms of getting deep meaning out of them. So thank you for joining us today. I'd like to start our meeting with the City of Flagstaff's land acknowledgement. So the City of Flagstaff humbly acknowledges the ancestral homelands of this area's indigenous nations and original stewards. These lands, still inhabited by native descendants, border mountains sacred to indigenous peoples. We honor them, their legacies, their traditions, and their continued contributions. We celebrate their past, present, and future generations who will forever know this place as home. And this process takes this land acknowledgement deeply and meaningfully. We were just with the Native American Club again at Flagstaff High School, which has become very excited about this process. And some of the data you will look at today was actually generated by a City Hall hosted engagement for Flag High School students at both the Native American Club and the Hispanic Heritage Club. And we deeply value the contributions they've specifically made to this process. So as you all know, you guys are our technical advisory group, and your purpose is to advise our staff and consulting team on data, assumptions, methods, how we're engaging the community, what we've learned, take our insights and really build better understanding together from what we are asking the community to contribute and what we're finding out from the data that we generate. There's not a quorum required, but I want to thank everyone because I think there's only a few people missing. And so your engagement and the breadth of your participation here is really valued by staff. We are, of course, committed to transparency. So as you know, these meetings are recorded and posted to our website along with Q&As and questions that help us engage folks so that we're not working in a vacuum here at the TAG. There is some staff attending these meetings, but if there's questions that need to go out to staff afterwards, I will be glad to get those out into the community. I think someone has to mute. Thank you. We are importantly going to have some really dynamic discussions. This is probably one of the days where we're going to see real debate and trade-offs and tough discussions getting started in this group. So it's important that we consider in our discussions both and discuss how these things can work together, and don't focus on debating to win a point in the discussion, but how we can build understanding and grow this process in a meaningful way. We ask you to be very mindful of power dynamics and airtime in the discussion. So if you've spoken and you know there's 20 or so people on this call, so if you have not heard a diversity of people speak, we'd ask you to hold and wait for a turn to speak again. Please stay present and participate and eliminate distractions. It's only 90 minutes. It's going to be very, very in-depth, but we do want to allow some space to explore things that are off in the adjacency or on the edges of what we're discussing. We don't want a narrowly tailored discussion that doesn't get at the real heart of what we need. If you have a question before you unmute yourself, we ask you to post a queue in the chat so we can call on people in order. And if you have a comment and it's not a clarifying question, it's like, I want to say something about that, put a C in the chat. We will generally call the Q's first and then go through and pull the C's for each discussion item. So please remember, Q's and C's go in the chat. That's how we'll make an opportunity for everyone to speak. And think about your airtime so that everyone has an opportunity. In between these meetings, we do ask the public to weigh in on outstanding questions and topics of interest. We'll talk about that today, what specifically we're going to do after Tag 3 and before Tag 4 to make that happen. The public can watch these meetings asynchronously. And there is a tab specifically on the regional plan website for scenario planning, where you can pull up all these meetings and the bios for TAG members that have given us bios. And I would ask you to look at that page. And if you think you've sent us a bio, and we don't have it posted, then you probably haven't. But we would like to have everyone's bios up there so people know who you are and the contribution that you're making to this project is recognized. If there are any other questions, I'm going to hand it off to Sachi Arakawa to take us through the next part of the presentation and the agenda.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us once again. So today's agenda, we have about 90 minutes, so an hour and a half from the top of the hour. We've already gone through our welcome on meeting logistics. I'm shortly going to give you an update on what we've been up to in the project since we met last, as well as forecasting into through summer, some expected events that you can look forward to. Then Ayano is going to talk about our Face the Future workshop highlights. And then finally, we're going to talk about growth ideas. So we're going to have about 40 minutes for a discussion to talk about growth ideas, which I'll talk a bit about later, but basically they are ideas that will seed our alternative scenarios that were developed during and from the Face the Future workshops, which we just wrapped up a couple weeks ago. And then finally, next steps. So we don't have a break programmed, but if you please take care of yourself, if you need to use the restroom, if you need to have a snack, go ahead and do that. We have about 45 minutes until the discussion. So if you could use that time to use the restroom, get some water, whatever you need to do, we'd love it if you could be present and in your seat during the discussion, so we can get the most out of getting feedback from you and hearing your thoughts on the growth ideas that we have to share. So we've skipped ahead here to our schedule. This is the project timeline for our entire project, which started in winter of 2022 and will be going through winter 2024, probably into spring a bit of 2024. So far, we have done the base 2045 scenario or business as usual scenario. We've looked at external factors and critical uncertainties, which led into the Face the Future Flagstaff workshops, which were just wrapped up with the public. We are now spring of 2023, where that nice red star is, and we're starting to build scenario themes. And the scenario themes come from these growth ideas that we're going to talk about today. Once the scenario themes have been created, we actually start modeling our alternative scenarios, and that's going to happen over the summer. Then when we have our alternative scenarios created, we actually bring them to the public in a series of public workshops where the public gets to weigh in on the performance of those alternative scenarios and ultimately choose a preferred scenario, which we then refine and ultimately shapes our future land use plans for the regional plan. There will be several opportunities for the TAG to participate throughout this process, including 2 just in the next between spring and fall. Sorry, if we can go back. One other thing to note, concurrently to the scenario planning process starting in late summer is policy discussions and implementation. So we'll be thinking about what policies and programming and implementation measures we need to start thinking about in relation to future growth decisions that we make. So that'll be happening as well. Now we can go to our upcoming events. So we have a lot going on this spring and summer. Between now, TAG meeting number 3 and TAG meeting 4, which will happen June 12th, we're going to administer a public survey. The public survey is about growth ideas for scenario planning. And again, we'll talk more about what growth ideas are. but they're kind of the building blocks of our alternative scenarios, and we're going to have a discussion on those this afternoon. I'm sorry, later in the hour, the afternoon of our meeting. Public survey will happen roughly May 12th to June 2nd. Sarah, correct me if that's slightly off, but I think that's the time frame we're shooting for. The goal is to have that wrapped up a little before Tag 4 so we can share the results of that public survey with you and talk more about these growth concepts at that Tag 4 meeting, which is June 12th. Then we'll have a public webinar, which the intention is to kind of share out information and report back on what we've been up to since we started work this winter, including what we heard from the Face the Future workshops and the business as usual scenario. We'll also, Sarah and her team will also be hosting 1 or 2 open houses throughout the summer that also have a similar intention of informing and reporting back to the public on the work that we've been doing. And then in kind of mid to late summer, we'll come back together again as a TAG group as we're starting to really be in development of those alternative scenarios and meet once again to get your feedback on those. Another update I wanted to give was on our community partner engagement. So if you'll remember, we have a set of community-based organizational partners that we've been working with from groups that we really wanted to hear from and have engaged in this process. They've been offered stipends to participate in this work. In our last round of engagement, the Face the Future workshops, we had maybe half or a little over half of these groups participate. And we'd love to see even more participation than that. We have, relationships and communication with these folks actively happening, but we know that our tag is also really, you all are active parts of our community and might have ties to some of these groups. So we're putting the call out for you to help us strengthen those relationships, help us get buy-in from some of these groups, and just generally get them excited about this process and about coming and kind of, weighing in and participating in future events. We'll have at least 2 more pretty large pushes for public engagement, most likely starting in the fall. That we'd really love to get them more involved in. And Sarah, if there's any particular groups you're interested in getting more, participation from, or think this group might be particularly well positioned to help you, get more connected with, feel free to put that in the chat or let us know. All right, so let's move on to some updates about the scenario modeling work. So Cascadia is developing a set of growth scenarios for the regional plan, and we're using a tool called Urban Footprint, which is a scenario planning software that allows us to model different growth patterns across the region in a form that we call scenarios. And I think we might need someone to mute themselves, and it's easy to unmute and have background noise. Thank you. So if we could go to the next slide. The scenarios that we're creating with Urban Footprint will be used for the regional plan to test various approaches to managing the region's growth. The business as usual scenario or trend scenario essentially models what happens if past trends continue and our policies don't change. So when we create that, it's sort of, modeling the location of growth following what we're seeing happen now today. And imagining that we haven't made substantive changes to policy, to the way that we spend money and invest, and the public priorities. We've now created the business as usual scenario, working closely with Sarah and Melissa's city and county staff, as well as local experts, and we have that ready to share. I think Sarah's actually offered to to do some type of lunch and learn where she can share a bit more about the business as usual scenario if you're interested in that. And Sarah, hopefully I'm not putting you on the spot here, but let me know if I'm off on that. There's other ways for us to share it as well. But this would be something that staff and the tag would be invited to. So if you are interested in that, I think Sarah may have an invite or an announcement on that forthcoming.
Yeah, actually, if you are interested in doing a deep dive on the business as usual and understanding it better, right now I am looking at May 24th at noon as a time. So if that works for you, if you just put in the chat that yes, you're interested and the 24th works for you, or no, yes, you're interested, but you need to do it at a different time. I'd appreciate feedback from everybody on that before I send out an invite. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Actually, if we could go back just a second so I can, so the business as usual is the first scenario that we do and that we've already created. That is sort of a foil to our alternative scenarios, so business as usual answers the question, what happens if we do the same old and we follow our current trend? The alternative scenarios ask what happens if we do things differently, and we can look at doing things differently in a variety of scenario types. So if we could go to the next slide. In the fall, after we've created the alternative scenarios this summer, the public will get to evaluate and compare those scenarios and ultimately choose which one is the best fit for the goals and priorities of the region. And the first step to creating these alternative scenarios is identifying these growth ideas that we've been alluding to throughout this meeting so far. Again, we'll talk more about these and we're going to give some examples of growth ideas that came from our public workshops. But in a nutshell, growth ideas respond to the question, how should we grow? And how should we grow given that we need to deal with external factors that are out of our control? So growth ideas are the building blocks of alternative scenarios. And each alternative scenario will include growth ideas that inform a growth idea or ideas that inform how the region's growth happens in that scenario. And if you'll recall back, it's been a few months, but to our first and second tag meetings, we actually, let me back up one second. So the growth ideas were developed through a public engagement process, which included you, the tag, as well as a series of public workshops that explored some critical uncertainties that the region might face and how we might, how different growth patterns might respond to those uncertainties. So now we're gonna go back and try to remember, dust the cobwebs off from tag 1 and 2. When we started talking about external factors and critical uncertainties. And so critical uncertainties were developed by doing some prioritization exercises and discussions with this group. And ultimately, we got to 3 essential elements of uncertainty, which were growth, so population and job growth, climate, and funding, meaning generally funding for public infrastructure. And so those 3 essential elements of uncertainty are uncertain because they can happen in the future at a low, medium, or high rate that we can't predict, right? So for example, infrastructure funding, we don't know in the future if state and federal funding for major infrastructure is going to be less than it is today or significantly more. And it's hard for us to plan or react without knowing that, but that's a reality of planning, right? And so we actually, if we could go to the next slide here, using the critical uncertainties that you identified, we use them as a central mechanic of a game called Face the Future Flagstaff, which asks the public how to decide or to decide how the region should grow in the face of these uncertainties that we identified. And you might remember, you may have seen some version of this, but this is the game board that we brought out to the public events to play with. It's about the size of a table, so it's really big. Several people can stand around it. It's got a map of the entire region there, as well as some tokens, growth tokens, those colorful things on the bottom of the game board there. Little squares that people could place that represent residential and job place types. And then in the kind of, I guess, top right-hand corner, people get to randomly choose a set of critical uncertainties that they have to react to in the game. Yeah, thanks, Aya. If we could go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit more about how those critical uncertainty cards work. So again, we identified, you all, the tag identified 3 critical uncertainties, and those became these cards that the players had to react to. So the first is climate change. Is our climate change impacts going to be low, medium, or high in the future? And players randomly choose one of those options, and then they have to react to that future in the game. Similarly, future residents and jobs. Are we going to have a population boom and have a lot of future jobs and residents, or are we maybe going to see a little bit of a decline, or at least sort of a stasis? So that's another factor that people had to react to as they placed their growth tokens around the region in different patterns. And then finally, infrastructure funding. Are we going to have enough money to build roads, to run utility lines, to do other public infrastructure improvements, or are we not going to have enough funding to substantively do that? So people for all 3 of these categories drew a random outcome, again, that they had to react to in the game. So to talk a little bit more about what we actually heard from the public as they played these games, I'm going to pass it over to Ayano.
Great, thanks, Sachi. Yeah, so in just 3 weeks, a lot happened, and it was really exciting to see what was accomplished by the project team. We were able to complete, and really the city and county staff led the completion of 13 workshops, 60 map game boards completed, and just under 300 participants participated across workshops that were either hosted by the city and county or were specially created to meet people where they are. So on that note, we had actually some great engagement from communities that we wouldn't typically see. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Sachi gave an overview of how the game board kind of functioned. Generally, I'll just review that the workshops kind of ran like this. We had many were hosted at the Aquaplex, and that after a big kind of brief overview presentation of how it worked, participants broke up and circled around tables and game boards of groups of 4 to 8 so that everyone got a chance to get their hands dirty on the game. After choosing those cards, they had to react to these set of critical uncertainties and place jobs and housing tokens, as well as identify areas on the map that they wanted to protect, maybe for environmental reasons or other priorities. Players had about 60 minutes to complete this challenge. Many took it on willingly, but it also acknowledged that it was pretty difficult. But that's kind of what we wanted. If it were easy, we wouldn't be here. Each session tried to end generally with a report back so that everyone could benefit from the collective wisdom of all of the different game boards. And that's how our sessions went. So, generally, we found that this was an effective tool for creating discussion and gaining insights in a novel format so that people could kind of, connect to the region and be more interactive than just having some kind of focus group or presentation. What really was a big highlight was engagement of communities that are difficult to reach or don't really feel like they have are compelled to participate in things like that. One group being youth. And so Sarah has already mentioned, we've they have already done a lot of work in forging a partnership long before we started this process with Flag High. And so we had the students from the Native American and Hispanic Heritage Club come and participate and provide some great insights with kind of how they see or want their future to look like. Similarly, there was one workshop that was exclusively implemented in Spanish first. And so with English translation for the few people who attended and needed that. So that I think was maybe like an exceptional kind of engagement accomplishment that this format of engagement was able to achieve. I'll let Sarah or Jordan maybe chime in if you'd like to add any other anecdotes on this, since I think this was a big deal.
Yeah, I think that really the city of Flagstaff has worked for a long time, but we don't produce a lot of our materials in Spanish unless we're asked to. We sort of have done it as a, if you need Spanish, tell us, as opposed to let's make something available and advertise it in Spanish and really pull it together with the assumption that we'll have a Spanish language space. And it was very successful. And what I'd say is that you won't see pictures because some of the community members who came are without legal status in the US, which is a very hard to reach population. And they had very different perspectives on growth and where it should be avoided and how growth does or does not benefit them as members of this community who are working here and raising families here, and part of our school communities and our communities that are here and supporting all of us but are unseen. And so I think that was a great success, and one I hope we can re-engage those individuals on when we have the opportunity. We also didn't have a sign-in sheet for that meeting as requested. And so we can tell you there were 17 people there who participated, and one group took it home and did it as a family. So I think that there's a lot to learn from that there's spaces we can make that feel safe and include that group. And although I think that the youth engagement was incredibly successful, what I would say is that demographically, our participation looked more like our age demographics than most had before. And we had several people who even came to our public workshops and said, I don't look around a lot of public meetings and see this diverse a group. So if that was our goal, is to build diversity and a place where more people felt welcome, I think we were successful. And I hope that reflects in the data that we're able to review with this technical group.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, and I think this is also just maybe helpful for us to keep in mind, and this is encouraging that we have 2 more rounds of engagement, and particularly in the phase of scenario choosing is when we really want to bring even more, diverse and representative perspectives into that process. So another plug for getting into your networks and with the community to help us with that.
If I can add one thing, Ayano, the Native American Club at Flag High School, actually, when we went yesterday, discussed if they would like to host one of our scenario choosing workshops. So, and be facilitators at it. So there's even an engagement opportunity to go above and beyond asking them to sit at a table where we're leading, but to give them an opportunity to lead. So anyways, if you can't tell, that's what gets me excited about these processes. It's not just the data, but it's how this data will look different because of the people who came to participate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I similarly, I got goosebumps with that idea. So that's exciting. Thanks for sharing that news. Well, yeah, and so right, with all of the great input that was received, was that much of a heavy lift for transcribing and digitizing the qualitative data we heard and the spatially based data that was placed, that came from the tokens placed on the map. And so that's what we're kind of seeing here. So big hats off to the city team and interns in particular who did all of that work with coding the qualitative notes that were taken during all of these game plays, and then for kind of doing the unglamorous work of helping transcribe where every token was placed on every single map. So this is just showing you kind of what that looked like after that was processed. And so we did our analysis among both of the data types that we received. And what we generally heard was kind of fell into the areas of growth, transportation, and land protection. What we heard was that there's general support for mixed use development, people wanting to see more amenities and services across neighborhoods, growing in these activity centers and managing density in a way that feels comfortable for neighborhood level. Transportation, again, general support overall and desire for more connectivity through transit across Flagstaff, and maybe specifically from certain hubs or areas outside of the city center. You'll see more about that in the growth ideas we'll preview. And then lastly, land protection. The open space and natural forested area is what makes Flagstaff special. And so that was heard loud and clear with both the spatial based kind of notes that were put on the map as well as comments from the discussion. So how do we get from the public input that we heard into scenario themes? So like I said, we've analyzed the input and identified some commonly occurring ideas for how the region could grow, which are what we are calling growth ideas. Ultimately, our job will be to package up different combinations of these growth ideas into 3 alternative scenario themes to be able to test out a range of hypotheses for how Flagstaff could grow and what would be the consequences, good or bad, from that growth. So that's kind of what we're seeing here. And let me show you actually a couple examples of this similar process happening in different parts of the country. On the top, that kind of row you see there is from Nashville's regional planning process that they called Nashville Next. You can kind of see the 3 scenarios, the B, business as usual, centers with infill, and then downtown and Pikes. And all of these are, describing briefly where jobs, housing, and transit would be placed for that particular scenario. The bottom half of the slide is another example from Portland's comprehensive planning process. And so similarly, there are 4 different distinctive scenarios here, 1 business as usual type, and then 3 alternatives that have a description of how growth will happen, and also accompanied by a little simplified graphic to show where spatially that type of scenario alternative where growth would take place in that scenario alternative. So this process that we're in right now is working towards creating this same type of product, a set of scenario themes that can test a range of hypotheses for growth. So we've been talking about growth ideas a lot already, and here's a big reveal now. So here are now 6 ideas for growth that we developed based on the Face the Future workshops, as well as bringing in the what we heard or what was heard during the visioning workshops that happened last year. So these are the ideas that we want to review and discuss with you today. So those are the rural activity centers, outfill, growth idea, urbanize Flagstaff at greenfield sites, focus on downtown and NAU, focus on East Flagstaff. Number 5 is prioritize conservation and avoid hazards. And then 6, this growth idea of attracting large employers. So, each of these growth ideas, have assumptions that were kind of collected together for how growth should happen and are intentionally distinctive to help us kind of play with the ideas of how we could combine them together for a scenario theme. So in a moment, this is just kind of the preview to show you the high level overview, but I'll share in just a moment kind of a little bit more detail about each. And so in order for you to not totally fall asleep here while we've been talking so much, we have integrated some quick gut check kind of polling. So the format will be, I'm going to share a little bit about each growth idea, and then pop up a poll for you to respond with kind of your gut check of, how intrigued are you to see this growth idea tested in a future scenario on a scale of 1 to 5. And then we'll move on to the next growth idea. And so this will be a little bit of a first impressions kind of phase. And then after we go through all of them in review, we're going to open it up for more discussion to talk about kind of questions, concerns, considerations for these ideas, so that we can hear more from this group. All right, how is everybody feeling here? Ready to go? I am going to encourage you as I move on to the next slide, take a big stretch and kind of, push out some imaginary walls on the side. Let's break through some walls today here with our discussion and energize our bodies here. And another way of warming up that I'll do is give you a nice little warm-up question here. So you should see something popping up on your screen, so you can keep stretching as you read this aloud. How ready are you to provide your gut reaction to each of these growth ideas using a Zoom poll? 1 being not ready, or maybe you fell asleep already, and then 5 being extremely ready, let's go. So I can see some responses trickling in here. Good to see more people are trending towards being ready to go. If you need to take a quick bio break, I recommend you do that now. We're actually doing pretty well on time. So maybe on that note, let's give ourselves 4 minutes to do that. Okay, I'm going to keep it really exact on 4. So let's meet back at 10:43. How does that sound? All right, and you can keep responding as we go. I'm going to move the slide so we can just take a quick break. Refill your coffee. Maybe pet your dog or your cat. Make sure your kids are okay.
I feel like this would be your perfect time to bring out your music selection.
I know. I was just saying the exact same thing. I didn't want to say it because I'm not prepared, but yes, you know me too well now. And I will restrain myself from, singing Cher or something like that.
Oh, that would be fun.
No, that's what you think, but when I start going, it's not fun. So.
Well, we'll work on break time karaoke for future tag meetings.
Yes, that's good. Goal accomplished for me. I'm always pushing impromptu karaoke sessions on people. I'm gonna just catch up with the chat here too. Let's see. Oh, good.
Yep, I answered a couple questions and.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I see that. Just looks like there's some possible leads for hosting future workshops. Awesome.
Yeah, Kim, that's a great idea. Puente would be a great location for the next round Spanish speaking workshop too, if we could get some support in reaching out, because their PTO has a lot of relationships with Spanish speaking households in the community.
Yeah, Sarah, and actually we can also pull in a Spanish interpreter if necessary. So I'll talk to you directly about that for dates and times.
Let's get a little chat about that on our calendars. Though we're not doing anything else, right, Kim?
No, I'm sitting around anxiously awaiting these meetings. I'm like, this is it. This is my chance. So we'll keep that on our calendar.
Oh, it's all good. That's how I appreciate everybody's time for this, because I'm doing it every day, but I love how we're all plugging in here. I'm going to go fill up my hot water cups with 1 minute left, right?
Yes. And similarly, I'll be right back.
anyone wants to sing a Jeopardy show countdown, feel free for about 60 seconds.
Okay. Great. Oh, David, you're offering to host. Great. Okay, let's get as many sessions we can here. Oh, right. And yes.
There'll be lots of swearing at that one though.
Oh, you were thinking more pub-like, like.
Yeah. So we gotta keep it colorful, keep it colorful. Okay, well, thank you all for just keeping with us here. I hope at least you're coming back from taking a nice little break, stretch break, water break. Happy also to see that most people are ready to go. Whoops, I didn't share those results with you. So this is the format that we'll take. So I'll give you a little bit of information, administer a similar type of Likert scale poll, and then we can all kind of take a glance at what people's level of interest is, and then move on to the next. And then we'll really get into rolling up our sleeves for a discussion after we get through kind of the little preview of each. All right. So
Yeah, and if I can just jump in here, Ayano. So I think the goal for this is for you to respond to the poll with your gut instinct, sort of your initial thoughts. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to throw them in the chat, and Alex, Sarah, and myself will keep an eye on it. But then we'll have an opportunity to kind of verbally discuss after we've gone through the concept.
Thanks, Sashi. Yeah, so yeah, we'll bring all of those up to surface level after we go through each one a bit. Okay, so first growth idea, rural activity centers. So first off, we're looking at a map here that is representing, where participants placed jobs or housing tokens. And so the density or kind of the concentration of those are represented by, the darker shades of purple is where more jobs or housing was placed versus lighter shades. So keep that in mind as you're also seeing what these, red and yellow or orangey kind of circles are, which are all of the rural activity centers per Flagstaff's regional, planning process or planning documents here. What we heard from Face the Future workshop participants was that they want to be able to build in more housing, jobs, and amenities into key areas, naming specifically Belmont, Doney Park, Kachina Village, Mountain Air, Winona even. So the assumption being, and the discussion about that, was that there would be less trips that would be needed from residents in those areas into Flagstaff City Center for basic needs. This is so then kind of bolstering resources in those areas, and also kind of bringing in more transportation connections with that too. So
There is a question in the chat, Ayano.
Oh yeah, thank you. David, yes.
Sorry, I was going to ask, is that projected or proposed number of residents or existing?
No,
Let me see
so
if I can, Iona, do you mind if I give a little explainer? Because these maps are going to come up again.
sure. Yeah, Steiny, thanks.
So the Face the Future game boards that were shared with participants, they had a grid on them. And in the grid, participants were able to place game tokens that represented jobs and dwelling units at various densities. So what we're seeing in this map is essentially an average for each grid cell across all of the workshops that happened, and the number of people and jobs that participants placed on average in each grid cell. So where you're seeing darker colors, it's saying that there was more agreement on more density in these areas. So it's not a forecast, it's not an estimate of future growth. It's simply where participants tended to want to see growth happen. So just want to be clear about that.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. Yeah, so any of the data, these growth ideas are kind of a summary of what we heard from the Face the Future workshops, visioning workshops, even things that were prioritized from the 2030 regional plan in some cases. So that's kind of why we've collected this set of growth ideas to get your input on, see your level of interest, to, you know, what are the things that might be worth testing in a scenario? What are the big red flags or concerns we must know, even if with testing these things? So I'll just add kind of on that note that, you know, the visioning workshops identified new activity centers and mixed-use walkable communities as a priority, and providing more services in rural activity centers to support communities such as Native nations outside of the region. So these are all kind of the threads we're pulling together with this growth idea. And now I'm curious to hear from this group, you know, knowing this, how intrigued are you to see rural activity centers, this growth idea, tested in a scenario? So I think, you know.
And Io, really quick, there's an important question that Ben wanted clarified in the chat. And I just want to say really quick to remember that the county also adopts this document. So while we often are talking about city and urban development, this also informs Coconino County's Board of Supervisors and their decision making. I don't know if Melissa wants to add anything to that while people are filling out the poll.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Sarah. And as you did mention in the chat, that so specifically this plan currently is adopted as an amendment to our comprehensive plan. So we review it when we are looking at certain projects like rezonings, subdivisions, that sort of discretionary approval type of project. So the goals and policies get reviewed as well as the future land use map. Although remember, the county does not have a similar future land use map, but that might be getting into too much details right now.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be in front of the Board of Supervisors for decision when this plan is finished.
Thanks, Melissa. About half of y'all have responded in the chat. I'd like to keep us moving. So I'm going to go ahead and close the chat, or I'm sorry, the poll in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to end the poll. This is not a decision-making tool. This is just a way to keep you engaged and give us kind of some real-time feedback of how people are kind of sitting with each growth idea. So generally, there's kind of a spectrum here from, you know, neutral to maybe intrigued here. I encourage you to continue to jot down your questions on your end, or put them in the chat about kind of what are maybe some equity considerations with a growth idea like this. What are other type of climate and resource management considerations that we need to think about this with this. All right, let's move on. Oops. All right, so growth idea number 2, urbanized Flagstaff greenfield sites. So we heard from workshop participants that areas like John Wesley Powell and the new hospital can be developed to become more relatively dense, specifically with mixed use kind of types and helping with regional activity centers. So this map, or these 2 maps actually on the screen, are showing, again, this is the average amount of jobs or housing. So jobs is on the right and housing is on the left in the red tones, of where participants placed where they wanted to see those growth, where that growth on the map. The future regional hospital is identified on both maps with that red-orange circle, and then that little squiggle that I think maybe most of us know where John Wesley Powell area is here. So you can kind of see that generally some more, on average, more concentration of participants placing tokens with jobs and housing along these areas. There was, yeah, and you know, related to this is comments that we received about building out and around the airport and expanding kind of that area surrounding as an industrial park with more offices, retail, and housing nearby, creating this as kind of a hub and finding more synergy with that with the new hospital. So this is what this growth idea would kind of be working towards or would be implementing. So let's get your response to this. And I'm going to set up. Oops, I have to close one first. There we
And
go.
so-
And while you're,
Oh, go ahead,
Oh,
Sachi.
sorry, just one reminder while you're setting this up, just we're not necessarily asking people if this would be your chosen growth idea that you would have or the best one, but simply, is it intriguing enough to test in a scenario? So that's the poll question. Go
And we
ahead.
should have time at the end of this to re-examine any of these. So I know we're going kind of fast right now, but that's in the interest of time, and there will be some additional discussion. I'll also add that, you know, this idea is distinct from the previous one, and that there are still some fairly large, what we would consider greenfield sites that are inside of Flagstaff's urban growth boundary. And so it's separate from the idea that unincorporated communities outside of the city of Flagstaff could become more sort of full service neighborhoods with commercial services, so that trips might get balanced out between those outlying areas and inner Flagstaff.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, so this is our way. We want to give you a little bit more context about each growth idea before we can, you know, open up a little more of a forum to discuss, but appreciate everyone continuing to clarify and pose comments or questions in the chat. I'm going to close the poll now.
Can I state one thing about this alternative too, is that the business as usual, which we aren't going in depth today, but is our point of comparison for these growth ideas, did not include things that are not entitled. So things like rezoning parts of John Wesley Powell, or the hospital rezoning case, which we know is getting us sort of another round of public hearing next week, were not included in the business as usual because they require a change. So that's why you may think we've been talking about these things, aren't they included? They were not included in our baseline. If those become approved, we may make some adjustments on where we show this, just as a clarification.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll, and I'll share the results with you. Oops. That looks like there's generally a little bit more interest to see this tested out. So let's move on. Okay. Our third growth idea. Oops, something. A second. Whoops. I'm getting a little too ahead of my skis on this PowerPoint. All right. All right. Can y'all see the growth idea 3 on your screen? Good, thank you. It's a little bit lagging on my end. All right, so this chart is showing the percent of housing units placed in downtown and adjacent areas by game participants. Okay, so this is again kind of data that we collected as part of the workshop series. So the percent of housing units placed in downtown and adjacent areas. The bars themselves represent, you know, critical uncertainty that was affiliated with that gameplay strategy. So in a summary of what we're seeing here, when funding or population growth was low, so that's that bar that's all the way to the left, low growth and low funding, participants prioritized transit and climate adaptation, and a larger share of housing was placed in downtown and adjacent areas. So, oops, there we go. So whether it was low growth or low infrastructure funding, more housing was placed in downtown areas, as you can see here. When players decided to use some of their funding to, mitigate the impacts of climate adaptation, or if they use some of their funding to gain more cells that they could draw public transit infrastructure funding for, they also placed more housing in the downtown and NAU kind of corridor. So this
Can I
is
add a little bit more to that, Ayano?
yeah.
Because this is, I think if you didn't play the game or if you didn't design it like we did, this is a little bit hard to wrap your head around. But the idea is that each group that played the game played it in a different way, right? So some of them got assigned different critical uncertainties. They got more growth, they got less growth, more funding, less funding. And some of them chose to allocate their budgets that they were asked to allocate in different ways. And so now that we have all of that data, we can filter it. And so essentially what you're seeing here is different ways of filtering the responses that were received. So rather in the first bar, rather than looking at everyone's responses, that's the responses of groups that got low growth as a critical uncertainty. And in the second highlighted bar, low infrastructure funding, those are only the groups that received a low infrastructure funding critical uncertainty. And then in the two on the right, that's a little bit of a different take. Those are groups that put more money into public transit or put more money towards climate adaptation. So just so that's, I know it's a little bit complex, but the idea here is that people who had those conditions or made those choices played the game in a different way, it seems, than other folks.
Thank you. And what we heard from comments, just more open-ended comments and discussion during the game is that people just truly saying that they wanted to see a more dense core for Flagstaff and the areas around NAU campus and the downtown area. The 2030 regional plan also identified creating downtown as the most walkable and connected place in the community. So these are kind of the threads that we were pulling together to posit as this particular growth idea for focusing growth on downtown and NAU. So let's see what you all think. I've just launched the poll. Let us know what you think. How intrigued are you to see focused growth on downtown and NAU as a growth idea to test in a scenario?
And as people are filling out the poll, I want to bring up something that we're discussing in the chat. So David had the question of, it seemed from the purple grid that it was very low density still, only about, half acre lots or half a unit per acre. But remember, we were asking people when people were putting tokens on existing areas, we asked them to think of it as how many additional units over what is actually there today. So we talked about it in a way of not like what's the total that should be in this grid, but what should be added to this grid above existing condition. You want to add anything to that, Steiny?
Yeah, that's right. So, if you add 200 housing units to a grid cell, you're not going to peanut butter those housing units equally across every square foot of that grid cell. They're going to end up on vacant pieces of land. They're going to end up on sites that get redeveloped. And that's going to end up being at a much higher density than if you peanut buttered it across everything. It's a little hard to wrap your head around. I can totally understand that, but I would not use that map to make any kind of statement about density.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll here and share the results with you all. Looks like This, among so far the growth ideas we've presented to you, this one has the most interest to test in a scenario. I think one other comment that came up related to this growth idea is that, you know, people want to see growth focused in the downtown and NAU corridor. However, you know, a lot of comments related to kind of building height that, you know, 4 to 5 stories is maybe the sweet spot, but really nothing more than 6 stories high was what we generally heard when we started talking about building height, stuff like that. So, all right, I will move us along here. All right. Our fourth growth idea, focusing growth on East Flagstaff. So this chart is similar to the one we just saw, but is showing the percent of housing units that players placed in East Flagstaff. And, you know, depending on what kind of critical uncertainty they got. Overall, what we observed and what we kind of concluded is that critical uncertainties, whether, you know, players were working under conditions with low or high growth or low infrastructure funding or high infrastructure funding, that didn't actually really matter, or influence the placement of housing in East Flagstaff, but it was groups who prioritized affordable housing, placed nearly half of their residential game pieces in East Flagstaff. You know, comments that we heard from the workshops were like putting growth on the 4th Street corridor to become more of a vibrant activity center, looking at Route 66, retail development, more government and tech development. Related to this were the visioning, was what we heard during the visioning workshops that wanted to maximize the availability of affordable and workforce housing. So you can see here that you know, no matter what the critical uncertainty, housing placed in East Flagstaff kind of prioritized the more affordable housing types, which was people trading in maybe more rural, less dense housing for more, you know, mid-compact development that is more affordable and more, not capital A affordable, but could be more affordable. All right.
Ayana, there's another question in the chat before you open a poll.
Great. David.
And
Please.
me again, sorry. Just from what you saw in the groups, was that communities in need saying they wanted more affordable housing in their own communities, or was it wealthier communities saying they want, parts of the community saying they wanted the affordable housing, you know, on the other side of town?
That's a great question. I don't think we were able to track that kind of level of specificity with who participated to be able to answer that. So
I can say that the affordable housing piece here, we didn't create a budget category for affordable housing on the sheet because it's sort of a programmatic one. But there were people who saved some of their budget from other things that would have given them gameplay just to emphasize affordable housing in their board. And that's what that 47% is people's whose mindset and thinking on the budget column was very targeted towards affordable housing, and probably at least one board every round added a category. From the conversations I was a part of, definitely heard people in East Flagstaff who said East Flagstaff should be better and there should be more services, and to get more services we need more people and transit in East Flagstaff. And then there were people who said, I don't like the West Side stuff going on near me in Boulder Point or Ponderosa Trails, and I think it should be spread out more and not all be centered around Milton and the Woodlands Village area, which is where we've seen a lot of change. So I heard both of those sentiments, even though I couldn't give you a breakdown of who said it where.
mm-hmm. I went ahead and launched the poll to get your gut check on this growth idea. And thanks, Sarah, for adding that in. Great. Okay, it seems like we're all getting the hang of this now. I'm getting responses fairly quickly. And And in the interest of time, I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1. 15 out of 22 sounds good enough for me. Great, and let's take a look at the results. So yeah, this is another one of those growth ideas that folks here in this room would be interested to see tested. This might be one that we can, of course, have more discussion on once we get through the last two. All right, thank you. So, growth idea number 5. This is the one that is very much all in on that land protection kind of themes that we heard in the workshops and in both the visioning and the Face of Future workshops. And so what we're seeing here is, again, this is a map showing, what game participants identified by using a green pen to kind of circle areas where they did not want any growth to happen. So these are truly, these are the protected zones. And so I just kind of toggled, whoops. Here you can kind of see there's not maybe a surprise and actually just really a broad agreement on where areas around the region we should not grow. And so the concentration of those is represented by the degree, like the color of the green on the map.
Ayana, if I could add, that there's sort of two flavors of how people use this. One is, this is a natural area, and I don't think growth is appropriate here, but I think they're reading into the comments. I think there were also people who used it to say, this is a neighborhood where I don't want change to happen. And you see that in some of the darker hues actually being kind of in downtown Flagstaff and some of the surrounding neighborhoods, for instance. So I think there's two things to unpack here, but the growth idea that I think we're trying to represent is more on the first side of things. So the idea that we shouldn't be growing in areas of natural significance or that have some climate change hazard like floods or fires associated with them.
There's one more flavor to this besides just avoiding growth in the existing neighborhoods around downtown that doesn't show up on the grid, that didn't because it came from just a few people at that Spanish language workshop, which is that 6th and 7th over the roads that are perpendicular to 4th Street have high risk of displacement of families. And there was a real robust discussion at multiple tables with Spanish-speaking residents that those areas need to be carefully considered as growth areas and managed for avoiding displacement of vulnerable populations and individuals and families. So that doesn't show up though on the grid because it was just a few people, but it was a very special and unique perspective that didn't come from other meetings as a consideration for number 5.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, and appreciate, Alex, that distinction. That was comments that we heard, wasn't just necessarily natural spaces, but areas that we wanted to protect because of concerns about gentrification. I've launched a poll to get your gut check on how you feel you'd like to see, if you're interested in seeing this growth idea that prioritizes conservation and avoiding hazards. Another comment that came up was about avoiding development on the west side for light pollution reasons. So that's another consideration, as well as specific existing protected zones that were named that are essentially highlighted on this map with the darker green colors. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll in 3, 2, 1. And let's take a look at the results. So this one is a little bit more of a spread here. Perhaps we can unpack that a little bit more in just a moment. But let's keep moving so that we have time to hear from you and not just to talk at you.
I also put a follow-up question in the chat of these topics of displacement and gentrification, if you want to put in what you think is really important about that one, because it is kind of a small grouping of things that are not all the same. So if you want to dive into that in the chat while Ayano does growth idea 6. Let's do that.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Okay, last one here. Growth idea 6 is strategy for attracting large employers here. So this map is showing the kind of concentration average number of jobs that is around Flagstaff. So you'll see on average that jobs were placed by game players somewhat evenly across the region. But for those who, used some of their budget towards more economic development tokens, so just meaning that they gave some of their budget in exchange for more jobs tokens, the concentration of jobs that were placed on the map, were outside of more of established employment centers. So that's what we're seeing here versus, and let's see if I can kind of click us back to kind of, there it is. When players did not, were not necessarily using that strategy overall, this was just the average placement of jobs. But for those who prioritized economic development and placed those additional jobs tokens, this is kind of what was uncovered with that. Other comments that relate to this was from the visioning workshops was this priority of creating economic resiliency and with high-paying jobs and diversifying economic centers within the region. Comments from the Face the Future workshops saw large employers as a hub and a driver for new housing. Anything anyone else want to add with this? I've launched the poll for attracting large employers as a growth idea. Are you interested to see this tested in a scenario? Great. Okay. And the good news is that right after this, like to turn it around and kind of elevate some of the comments and the discussion happening in the chat. And I might look to Alex, Sarah, for you to help kind of build off of what you've been monitoring, Sachi, as well. Thanks. All right, closing the poll in 3, 2, 1. Slide in that last submission. Okay. All right. As you can see here, this one also has a bit of a spectrum with level of interest. Surprising? I don't know. Let's talk about it. So here again is just a summary of those growth ideas. And let me, I think since I haven't been able to check in on the chat, Alex, maybe let me ask you, what would be something you'd like to follow up on that's been elevated?
Yeah, I want to circle back to a comment made by Steve Gerke about rural activity centers. Steve said that in addition to the things that it states here, it would also seem to support leapfrog development, i.e. sprawl, without strong concurrency policies in transportation and land use. Steve, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't know that I need to add much more other than just place the comment out there. I just think that I think it's a lot more to unpackage. I think that you can talk about how we reduce BMT and perhaps promote some more walkable trips, but we're still going to sort of have Flagstaff being the predominant center in our region. So I think that if we start to see growth out there, maybe you get some of those short hit walking trips if you have real good mixed use policies, but if not, you're going to sort of have a lot of sort of longer commutes happening and longer trips still happening to the city center.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's just one aspect of it to also think about, in that unless we have this transit options that are at the same time of that development, those are going to be car trips, right?
Yeah, those are great points, Steve. And we at this stage, I don't think we need to, nor should we be value judging these as good or bad ideas, but ideas worth testing. And this one came out pretty strongly in the comments and from a lot of the participants. But at the end of the day, the scenarios will tell the story, hopefully. And so all that is to say, we may think, this is a bad idea for the region, or it may not be the best for reducing car trips. But we can show that through the scenarios process and then let the public weigh in on whether they still think it's a good idea or not.
Sure, I
so-
absolutely agree with your points of the value onto that, just making sure that that's also kind of understood within that presentation of it.
Absolutely, yeah. I wanted to ask, in addition to these 6, are there any others that, from what you've seen so far, or what you know about the region, or if you attended the workshops, that you think we've missed? Maybe a more pointed question, getting back to Sarah's comment about the areas on either side of 4th Street in East Flagstaff that are particularly susceptible to displacement. How do we want to treat those in these scenarios? Would an approach be to say, would a growth idea associated with that be, don't grow here? Or does that not make sense? Is that not appropriate to do? Anyone have any opinions on that?
Hi, this is Kim Robinson. And about that area, it is a historic area. Sunnyside and Southside are historic areas. And they seem to be disregarded when it comes to growth, as in people aren't interested in making the existing area better for the residents. They're interested in knocking down that area or having plans that would apparently push the residents out. So I would like to see those areas, West Street, Sunnyside, and Southside, and Plaza Vieja, be regarded as, with respect, as historical neighborhoods and be treated as such.
And so would that to you, does that look like no development, or development that's targeted, or that follows a certain policy? Like, for instance, focus on underutilized commercial sites so that you're minimizing direct displacement of residents. Could that be a potential growth idea?
Absolutely. And when I'm talking about downtown and those historical neighborhoods, I would like to see more refinement, not necessarily growth. So using what's already there, the existing infrastructure, the abandoned buildings, the underutilized buildings, seeing those repaired, remodeled, and put to use for the community with respect to what the community wants to see there.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So not a huge change to what is allowed to be built there by zoning, but rather kind of a restoration to what those communities, the level of investment that happened in those communities when they first were being developed, maybe.
That's true. And I do like the term restoration. I'm thinking more about use what's already there, refine, remodel, improve what's already there with respect to the historical importance of those neighborhoods, making sure that the refinement that happens there, if it leads to growth, does not push the existing residents out in terms of property values and in terms of services that they don't need in the community.
Understood. Thanks, Kim. That's really helpful. Does anyone else have any other, with that maybe inspiration, other growth ideas that maybe we didn't touch on?
I was looking at this and I'm wondering about number 2 with the urbanized Flagstaff greenfield sites. And I kind of thought to myself, well, what about the idea of, almost creating like a new downtown, right? Like shifting the urban core. But then realized that to a certain extent, that's what number 2 is suggesting, right? Is that there's a new dense area that's, completely new. And so perhaps it's just reframing that one more to be more clear that that's what is being proposed.
Mhm. Anyone have any agreement or disagreement with that refinement of number 2? On sort of a related topic, I did want to ask about all 6 of these. For those who feel like they understand the development community and sort of the market and what's happening in your region, which of these seem most aligned with what the real estate market would want to do? And which seems less in line with that?
I was gonna give someone else there you go, see what David said. 2, 3, 4, 6.
So urbanized.
David Carpenter just put that in the
Yeah.
chat.
Yeah.
You, David,
Likewise.
other
I
David.
think that, I mean, I think I agree with David. I mean, I think focusing on East Flagstaff is a challenge because, if you're looking in a community that's got, generally lower rents and lower purchase prices, there's less opportunity for investment. Focus on downtown and NAU is, I think there's a bit of a question of whether that's built out already. In areas where folks can go in without having to go through the rezoning process, then, that's attractive. But if you have to go in for rezoning in an area that's surrounded by neighborhoods in Flagstaff, that's very difficult to achieve. I mean, 2 is the kind of, it's the lowest hanging fruit because you can, and that kind of why I was interested in it, right? Is that if you can achieve density, which helps with our climate goals in a new area without a whole bunch of people around to complain about it, then, you've got more chance of success.
Mhm. I want to circle back to a couple of comments here. Michelle mentioned that number 2 is like the Metro Plan growth plan. That's interesting. That had not occurred to us, but it's worth thinking about for sure. We don't have a super clear idea of what exactly number 2 would entail in terms of where growth would happen. Just sort of general ideas.
Recording in progress.
So that's interesting.
If I can just say for a second on the Metro Plan stride forward scenario for their transportation plan is actually a combination of what if we did 3 and 4 and not the other things, essentially. But they do have a scenario that's the onward scenario that looks at number 2, just as a clarification.
Understood. I want to get to something that Tyler said. I know we're very short on time, and Sachi, if you'll permit me, if we can go just a little bit into the next steps discussion. Is that okay? I'm going to take your silence as complacency.
I tried to give a thumbs up emoji.
Okay,
Yes.
there it is.
Alex,
Gotcha.
I do want to give at least a minute or so to do one last pull because
Is that the combinations one?
it's not. It's just overall. Which
Okay, right. Okay, so just really quickly, something to be thinking about. Comment from Tyler is really appropriate here. Some of these scenarios, or some of these, I'm not going to call them scenarios because they're not. They're growth ideas. Some of them overlap, and that's intentional, or they're related, maybe is a better way to say it. Any scenario we test is going to be comprised of multiples of these because they aren't mutually exclusive. And so Tyler says that avoiding hazards would naturally lead to urban infill. Well, that's a really insightful comment. And a question that we'll bring to you next time is, as we start to form a more cohesive package for each of our scenarios, which of these fit together? And so I think Tyler's hit on 2 that probably do make sense as being considered as part of one scenario, which is prioritizing conservation and also maybe urbanizing downtown, because you're restricting growth in some areas and you're promoting growth in other areas, and those kind of make sense together. Yep. Okay. So, and then Julie, just quickly, we'll end with you, Julie. What is your comment?
It really has to do with the John Wesley Powell corridor. And when we looked at the original regional plan, there was a state land parcel out there plus 400 acres. Since that time, that state land parcel has been purchased, and there are development applications that are underway along that corridor that might look a little different than the current regional plan. And really what we're seeing how people are playing chips on there. And so I just want to be really careful and recognize that there are private property rights through there. So for us to put a whole bunch of chips and show density and intensity without considering entitlements and environmental impacts, I just think there are some things that need to be considered, because I don't want to give people the idea that there is this huge opportunity in this corridor to put all of our growth into that place. That's just how I'm seeing it shake out.
Yep.
And so I just have some concerns about how it gets communicated, how it gets shown, and the amount of effort going into I just really needing to be pragmatic about it.
Absolutely. Everything that we hear from the public is going to be filtered through a lens of what does existing zoning say? What are if a project's underway, we're not going to even bother to test something that is out of whack with what's underway, those sorts of things. So we'll certainly be considering that and appreciate that you're bringing that to the fore. So I know sorry, go ahead.
I think we need to wrap it up soon.
Let's do it. Yeah, take it away.
Yeah, and I think that just like Alex said, this is part of why we have this feedback loop to bring this information that we've heard from the public in this first round. We gave them a task to kind of, in ways, have restrictive but also unrestricted placement of where they want to see growth. All of that there's much more nuance and depth and detail that we intentionally removed from this exercise with the Face the Future workshop, but it's so that we can have something to work with and discuss here and then back when we come back with the public. So I'm going to launch our last poll for you to now just weigh in across all 6. Which of these growth ideas would you be most intrigued to see tested in a scenario? So this is the same question we've asked before. You have the chance now that just after the kind of passing through all of this to weigh in. I will acknowledge that you could put all of these as being highly intrigued, most intrigued, putting as one if you want. There's no harm, no foul with that, but we would like to see kind of in relationship to each other, which one within this group do folks feel there's most interest behind. And this is just one kind of data point that we will be using to shape and start to form the scenario themes. So this isn't a decision-making question, it's just to kind of get people's sentiment about it. This is a longer question, so
maybe Sachi can start on her next steps wrap up while people are deliberating.
Yeah, and then we can share the results after.
Yeah, thanks. So next steps, May 24th, sounds like most or several people were able to make that date for the business as usual lunch and learn, which Sarah will lead and share that scenario. Then June 15th, we have the public webinar. June 12th, we have our tag meeting number 4. So make sure and check your calendars for that invite. If you haven't seen that already, we will be diving a little deeper into some of these growth concepts, scenario themes, and, kind of starting to the beginnings of creating the alternative scenarios. We'll also have that public survey that's going to be in the interim between now and the tag 4 meeting. And we'll be sharing those results with you at tag meeting number 4. Then finally, Sarah and Ayano might be following up with some of you about CBO engagement assistance. And thanks for some of the comments in the chat already about how we might be able to leverage your connections.
Thanks, Sachi.
Yeah.
Oh, I just was going to announce, we have most folks weighed in. I'm going to close the poll. Hopefully you can get your feedback in 3, 2, 1. Oh, I still see some things shaking around. Okay, 3, 2, 1. All right, let's take a look at how things kind of shook out here. All right, so just to orient ourselves, the blue to the left, the 2 blues are on the more intrigued, more interested. If the bar has more yellow or orange, that's less intrigued. So what I'm seeing here is, something kind of related to how the discussion went, more interest in focusing on downtown and NAU, focusing on East Flagstaff, and maybe greenfield sites, attract large employers, and rural activity centers are kind of the second tier of that. Baked in is maybe this, if we do those things, we would kind of take care of prioritizing conservation and avoiding hazards. So thank you for taking a little extra time to look at those results with us. Anything else, Sarah, before we close?
Yes, we are putting together a broader survey about these growth ideas, along with some other kind of guiding principles. They're not as geographically specific. We're going to send that out and give you some idea of what feedback on the prioritization of different pieces the public has. We're kind of calling those growth ideas as well, but they are not the same 6 that you're looking at here. They're kind of broken out into more focus on corridors and kind of getting another more refined level of what we might need to include as we start building scenarios. So we plan to send that out tomorrow and keep it open until June 2nd. And I'll send it to all of you, and I hope you'll help disseminate the survey to your networks and to people you think should be replying and getting involved. The only other thing that's not on this slide is that our in-person open house, which will include like reviewing the public webinar, will be June 26th at 6 p.m. at City Hall. Given that it's the summer, I'm not holding 10 meetings, but if anybody wants us to come out and do a smaller meeting or come discuss a specific topic as staff, please reach out to me and let me know what you're interested in. Thank you all for your time today.
Great, thanks. Have a
Thanks,
good rest.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.